G'day and welcome to the channel. My name's Luke Rowe, and in today's episode we're going to be looking at the second installment of our three-part series on elevating learner success. It's a series that I've been engaged in with my institution, Australian Catholic University here in Melbourne, and this one is on the principles of powerful practice. If you've been following my YouTube channel, you'll see that I've engaged in that content before because I'm writing a book on it. And it really talks about this idea of practice along the lines of four key pillars. And that's illustrated by the acronym R.I.D.E, as in riding a bike, R.I.D.E. Retrieval practice, interleaved practice, distributed practice, and expert practice. And so they're the four pillars that we're going to lean into for this presentation. I've chopped out some of the irrelevant bits, and I will jump in to correct the record where I've made some mistakes, because ironically, I was scrambling this presentation together literally in the minutes before I went live, so I did not have a chance to practice my presentation on powerful practice. Now, I know that is super ironic, so please don't give me a hard time in the comment section about it, but instead I ask for your grace as you listen to this and listen to me make plenty of mistakes, but hey, we're all learning here. So I hope you get something out of it, and please do give me some comments in the comments section if it connected with you or if you got something valuable out of this video. Thanks for watching. Unlocking expertise through practice. Like any good educator, we'll recap what we did last time. So we talked about this idea of deep and meaningful learning, anchoring new knowledge to prior knowledge, conceptualizing beyond rote learnings, levels of analysis to the way we're thinking and encoding information in our brains and meeting that with our prior knowledge and our prior models of the world. So there's real world application and relevance to that. That's what makes it a huge benefit to our survival. We learn that we may live, and that was one of the mottos that I hope you walked away with there. We talked about three different theories: Aussie Bell's meaningful learning theory, levels of processing theory by Craig and Lockhart, and the Bayesian brain theory, which has its roots way back with Reverend Bayes, but the modernized version with Carl Friston and a few others who have brought that into the sort of mathematical domain. And that certainly found its way into predictive modeling, machine learning, and large language models that we know today. The implications were looking at harnessing the power of story and how that creates a mental model or a schema for inviting our audience into that as we bestow wonderful wisdom and knowledge upon our students, and we share a mental model together through story. We ask deep and meaningful questions, and there are levels to that game. We know that the greatest teachers always ask more questions and higher quality questions than those who don't hit the heights of greatness. And then we talked about generating, linking, and elaborating with our prior knowledge as the most powerful snowball in which to attain and promote future knowledge. So that's the recap there. So there's four pillars of practice, what I call four pillars of powerful practice. And I'm writing about this now, and hopefully a book will come out sometime next year on the four pillars of powerful practice. So if you do have any ideas and examples that pop to mind along the way, send me an email. I'm going to cast the line out and fish for ideas and examples, because when I sent this book for the first draft publication, it came back not enough examples, not enough anecdotes, too academic, too dry. It's written for a popular audience. So I'm going to put it out there and be shameless and say, I would love your ideas to intermingle with this model. So this is called the R.I.D.E model, and I'm not able to skip the slide. I have to do that manually. And that's what it looks like. So retrieval practice, interleaved practice, distributed practice, and expert practice, sometimes called deliberate practice. So that's your acronym, that's your mental model, that's our schema that we can share and go deeper with. What do I mean by practice? These are things that we repeatedly do to get better. All right, so the things we repeatedly do to get better. So I'm talking very broad brushstrokes here. I'm not just talking about domain-specific study skills, and they're great, but I'm talking about more transferable study skills, things that we can use for our own personal lives, as well as in our teaching and education roles. So that's the kind of model from the book. And I'm going to substantiate that with these four questions and all these four inquiry-based questions and avenues to go down. So what is it? What's the evidence say? And how does it work? And I'll give you some examples of how you can do it in your own teaching practice or in your own life as a learner yourself. So let's talk about retrieval practice. But before we do, I've got a quick quiz for you because I know how much you love them. I want you to answer the question there. So it says, which of the following study techniques is best for long-term retention of material? And I don't think I can see the chat. Is the chat disabled or is it on? Maybe someone can relay to me once we've collected a few answers, what everyone's thinking, A, B, C, or D.
We've got 2 C's,
Mm-hmm.
an A, and A/C, C or D, C.
Oh, okay.
No love for D.
No love for D. No.
Where's the E?
Yeah, all of the above, some of the above.
Monica, cheat off a friend.
Yeah, no phoning a friend in this one. We can
More, I think most C's are the winner.
All right, so you think concept mapping. That's interesting. Very interesting. So maybe Inspire and John Marnie have primed you for that, but I'm going to say taking a brief practice quiz. And there's a significant amount of research to substantiate that in relative terms to concept mapping that has been studied, and I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the things that will come up, though, with students, so concept mapping I would put second on the list. So that was a close second for those of you who put that in there. But students in high schools, when given this little quiz, they'll almost invariably put rereading. Reread, 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 reread. And there are big problems with that, and we'll find out why later. So hopefully this is informative, and I've primed you to pick up more information on that, because we talked about this last time. When our brain builds a mental model of the world and all of a sudden its prediction and expectation is violated by an assumption that isn't met, as in an error signal is gauged, we're far more readily able to learn and fill in that gap. So you've got the slingshot ready, the tension's there for you to pick up information. So that's a good thing. So this is why we talk about errors as something to celebrate in learning. As long as we don't stay there in error, we need feedback, we need more information, we need to correct that error. So what is retrieval practice? Well, it's improving memory by actively bringing to mind previously learned material rather than just rereading. And that's often the control condition in a lot of the studies. So bring your memory from the back of your mind to your front of your mind in your working memory. So long-term memory being fed into working memory. Pooja Agarwal, who I highly recommend if you want to go down this rabbit hole and check out some of the academic literature on this. Her work is second to none, and she does this a lot in classroom research. So real-world settings is her specialty, and she talks about this as an active attempt by a student to recall or recognize and then reconstruct. So she's talking about elaborative aspects here, their memory of knowledge during initial learning. And I love the way Charan Ranganath, I think that's how you pronounce it. I love the way he speaks about this. He's got a wonderful book. I think I've got it on the shelf somewhere here. It's called How Memory Works, I think, and he's a wonderful researcher. And he talks about memory as being more like a painting than a photograph. All right, and I think that's important here because the idea of retrieval practice is predicated on this notion that we're not just bringing back a recording and pressing play of the past, right? The brain doesn't work like that. And thank God it doesn't, because there's a huge cost. Remember, we talked about the metabolic cost of learning is very high. So we have to be very selective on how we do it. But it's also because if we had a recording that covered all of the information that we encountered and we didn't discern the gist or the crux of that information and store just that compressed, vital, most relevant elements, then our brains would explode and we wouldn't be able to discern the more from the less important. I made a bit of a mistake there. The book is actually called Why We Remember by Dr. Charan Ranganath, and it is a fantastic book. The reason I didn't have it behind me in the bookshelf was because it was at home on my bedside table. I've been reading it recently and reviewing it. It's the second time I've read it. I love the book. I highly recommend you purchase a copy, go through it, and it'll really enrich your understanding of human memory. And it's by a great researcher. So Highly recommend that. I think the main thing I wanted to impress upon you here is that the reason why it's so special, this characteristic of human memory as opposed to a video recording, is that it only retains the gist, the key elements, the mental model, if you will, of the world. And the way I like to explain this with my students is that it is like the same distinction you have between the map and the territory. And mental models are analogous to the map, right? And the territory is analogous to the real world out there. And we just continue to enrich and build our map to help us navigate the territory, to help us navigate the real world. And when we have a model, a mental model that we can change at will, that we can enrich, that we can continue to infuse with our own subjectivity and paint with the brush of our personal experiences, we can build a mental model that is more helpful and more adaptive. And certainly we can enrich our learning for our students if you're in the business of education and instruction. So, and it makes it more transferable from one context to the next. So that's all I wanted to impress upon you and wanted to correct the record there with the book. I hope you can get a copy and check it out. Right, so the painting aspect means that we're bringing the gist, the meaningful elements, the mental model of our past to the present upon retrieval, and that's malleable. And the exciting part about that is this speaks to the more subtle point, which is if it's more like a painting than a photograph, we can manipulate it. We can add to it. We can elaborate and extend upon that picture, right? So memory isn't a recording. It's more like a combination of the past and the present and your future expectations and your imagination, right? So when we reconstruct the past, we're bringing our imagination into it as well. And that's a really important piece for students to know because they can enrich and extend their learning with that. The other thing to point out here, and this is speaking to the earlier quiz that I gave you, the question that I gave you, is this idea that retrieval practice is often manifest in testing, practice quizzes. We think that they're very low-level learning, but it depends how you do them. And it depends on the thinking that goes into that, in how you answer the questions, and how you tell yourself not just which is the correct answer, but why is it correct and the other's incorrect. That's an important piece as well. So this idea of retrieval practice is often spoken about as the testing effect. And that refers to the finding that tests are not merely opportunities to assess one's learning, but are potent learning opportunities themselves. And so there's a great deal of research to attest to that, and I recommend that paper by Cubic on this. Now, it's about this point where I often get asked the question, is retrieval practice just about doing multiple choice questions or short quizzes? And the answer is absolutely not. There are many different ways to do retrieval practice, and you can go as far as you want with different forms of retrieval practice, from the seemingly mundane with short practice quizzes, multiple choice quizzes, true and false questions, to really elaborate essay building formulas, right? So you can start to use part whole practice where you start to work on introductions of essays with your students, and they have to retrieve the information, write a component of an essay or a subsection of an essay, and then they gradually do that until they can build a full essay in an extended period of time. You might break it up into 5-minute sections, 10-minute sections, and that's a form of retrieval practice. So engaging in deep, elaborative processing when you're writing out essays that are answering complex questions, or even in dialogue with your peers, having to defend an answer to a question or defend a particularly controversial point of view is a form of retrieval practice. You really do need to access multiple strands of your mental models and your memory to be able to defend yourself, to be able to answer questions with evidence and substantiate your position. So these are all forms of retrieval practice. We don't want to get caught up in the idea that retrieval practice is just about looking at true and false or multiple choice question quizzes. So I just want to impress that upon you. I hope you keep listening and enjoying. So what's the evidence say? There's been a flurry of reviews into this space, meta-analyses, and these are the most recent, 3 of the most recent. And what we can see in the table, Stoller and Krieg were the first in this recent flurry to release those. They had, I think, the largest yield, over 230 studies, I think, an effect size of 0.42. And so that's a medium to large effect on academic outcomes. So the learning outcomes, the academic growth between time point 1 and the final time point, or the exam or the test or the essay, we're seeing a lot of growth when students engage with retrieval practice systematically through testing or other forms of retrieval practice. Yang and colleagues, similar effect size, and as I mentioned, Pooja Agarwal, who really did focus on classroom-based research. So we can't critique these and say they're not real-world studies, because when we put retrieval practice to the test in the real world, it falls flat. All the students can't stand it. It's boring. Well, I would always argue that sometimes learning is difficult, and you can spice these things up and make it more enjoyable as well. Students have to be actively learning to be enjoying themselves, otherwise they're going to disengage anyway. So there's a lot of credible research out there to show that it has a huge impact on learning. Certainly worth our time. There's a sort of branch on this tree of the research where you've got relative comparison points rather than, and this is one of the ways that researchers can make anything look good. Right, I can make the effect of, I don't know, eating cheeseburgers a really effective impact on studying skills if I compare it to, falling asleep or going and I don't know, doing something dangerous. Now, the point that I wanted to make here is that as a researcher, you tend to grow quite cynical of seeing terribly chosen, cherry-picked reference points that are going to make any intervention look good. And often the way to get around that in the research world is to have a status quo reference group, so that you've got students engaged in business as usual activities, whatever that may be at a school. And that becomes your comparison point to see if an intervention is effective, right? And so the comparison point for studies that look at the benefits of retrieval practice are often things like rereading the material, because this is a behavior that we know students engage in as a matter of business as usual, as their status quo or as their default approach to study. So it's a reasonable argument to suggest that that's the control group's condition, and so we compare the impact and benefits of retrieval practice relative to that condition. There is another strand of research that brings a more rigorous lens to this, and that's when we have what we call gold standard comparison groups. And this is where you start to get the best known existing practices in education, and they become your benchmark for your control group. So your control group engages in the best known practices in education, and then you compare your intervention to that, because what you're looking at is this concept called incremental validity. What value add can I get out of this additional intervention compared to what we're already doing with gold standard practice in my school or in my institute? So it's worth considering that. And if you do read research papers, always pay attention to what they're comparing in terms of the intervention group, the intervention arm, and the comparison arm or the control group. If it's cherry-picked, then you can make anything look good or any intervention look effective. So it depends on your comparison point in a research program as to how much significance or weight we put on the effect sizes, right? So when we talk about retrieval practice, often it's compared to rereading. And some people might say, well, look, most people know that's not an active learning technique. So most teachers, most students would point away from that, right? So that's not a realistic benchmark. It's a low cherry-picked benchmark to make retrieval practice look good. But even when you compare it to other forms of learning and elaborative studying with concept mapping, it's still superior to that. And the irony of this study and this whole branch of research that came out from Janelle Blunt's work was that retrieval practice and practice testing was even more effective at criterion tasks that involved concept maps than the original study preparing for those concept mapping tasks, right? So it's that effective at creating the deeper encoding that it's worth doing, even if the criterion task, the outcome measure, is a concept map over and above concept mapping. So this is why, and there's more research here, but I'm just pointing to the first study that she did to attest to that. This is why I would rank concept mapping lower than practice testing. That's kind of how you can do that. You can also combine the two. Obviously, concept mapping is a form of retrieval practice, but I'm talking about practice testing as a form of retrieval practice relative to concept mapping. Now, we talked about this idea of learning from the inside out. Right. The old thesis was that learning was about getting information in. And a lot of these psychology textbooks, and I pointed to some that are behind my back now, we'll talk about the models, input, processing, output. That's cognition, and they're like toy models, right? So you've got sensory memory, then you've got your short-term memory and your working memory interacting there, and then you've got your long-term memory where it all gets stored in there. And the job of a teacher, an educator, is to put as much in there as possible. Right? And these passive receptacles called students, they just gobble up that information. Right, so that's the kind of caricature of that. Now, I know that doesn't happen here because we've got great quality teachers, but this is the schema that I think has misled many people to believe that that's how learning happens. Now, there's an antithesis, right? To every thesis, there's an antithesis, and the antithesis came in the form of the probabilistic modeling, predictive modeling, active inference, and what I talked about last time, one of the theoretical models leading that way is called the Bayesian brain hypothesis, although it's not the only model there on predictive processing and the impacts of projecting your model out onto the world. And then when you see a violation in that expectation, only then do you update and assimilate and accommodate information in that way. But that's a little too strong, right? So we know it has to happen a bit both ways. So the synthesis there is to say that we've got a bit of both happening, but the vast majority of what's happening there in any given moment in a learning instructional experience is you have your students or yourself always projecting a mental model onto the world. And that default model, we go in there to any particular topic or conversation with a whole lot of prior knowledge that we impose on the moment. And that meets the new information. If there's something novel, relevant, or a violation to expectations, only then do we start to key in on that and update. So retrieval practice and all of the R.I.D.E model is predicated on this idea of kind of shifting the directionality of your thinking around learning. Instead of just cramming information in, it's about getting information out. And I talked about last time, the information highway. If we saw the information highway flow around our brain and between our brain and the environment, we'd see most traffic going out, not most traffic going in. So that's an important principle to consider there. So why is it so helpful when we repeat retrieval practice and we actively engage and bring memory to the fore? Well, part of it's to do with the architecture of our brain. So our brain needs to have different mechanisms to signal the importance of something so that they know whether to pay the price or keep the money, so to speak, with the metabolic cost that is paid to store a long-term memory. Remember, that's the body's always undergoing a cost of living crisis. Where should it spend its energy to survive and flourish? And it has to be selective about it. But one of the ways it starts to prioritize things is if they're repeated, right? And if they're effortfully engaged with. And so the architecture of the brain wraps itself around and responds to the stimulus and the habitual patterns of thinking and retrieval practice that you impose upon that. So the more repeatedly that you engage with a particular concept or a way of thinking or a thinking process, you have this, what Donald Hebb, teacher turned neuroscientist back in the 1940s, said was use-dependent pathways starting to form in our brains. So about 83 billion neurons happening in there. They're the nerve cells, and they've all got these nice tentacles out there trying to connect and talk to each other. And those start to organize themselves in response to how we engage with the world and how we think internally. It's also the internal world that shapes most of the neural architecture, not just the external environment. So that's the causal mechanisms here. When we start to impose retrieval practice on our brains, we're starting to intentionally build the neural architecture so that you have a more efficient network of neurons being able to store and retrieve successfully and access successfully those memories that you and your students want to bring to the fore. All right, so that we sum up as this notion of neural plasticity, where you have structural, functional, and connectional elements and chemical elements in the nervous system that wrap themselves around and build themselves around this idea of repeated experience. So we often summarize it like this with Lal and Singer's quote, the famous quote, neurons that fire together, wire together. They don't quite touch though. So we have a space between all of the neurons. They're suspended in various fluids and there's certainly other cells in between, but they communicate over those spaces with chemicals. And that's an important concept to remember there. I want to ask you this question. So now that we've done a little bit of brain function and functional anatomy, what do you think the answer to this is? Now, for those of you who are listening on the podcast, I'll read out the question here. It says, long-term memories are primarily formed through changes in the strength and efficiency of synaptic connections rather than via the frequency and volume of neurons. Is that true or false? And of course, it's true. And the reason why I wanted to stress this point is because often people think that you grow your brain like a muscle. All right, so we think that if we do lots of study, we get a really buff brain and we start to grow it in terms of its size and its neurons. There is a very small, weak relationship between the size of the brain and intelligence. That's mostly to do with the lower end of the tail of distribution there, because we know that children who are born with undeveloped brains due to various conditions tend to have lower intelligence throughout their lifetime. This can also be related to things like a malnourished mother or the mother going through drug use or having chemotherapy during gestation. So these are all caught in the studies that look at the brain size versus intelligence, and they correlate those without looking at the causal mechanisms. It certainly doesn't really have much validity to it at the other end of the distribution. You can't just assume that because people are really intelligent, they've got massive brains. It's not how it works. That's the old pseudoscience of phrenology, and we've moved on from there, fortunately. So I guess the main thing is your brain is not like a muscle. It's not going to grow bigger and you're not going to develop new neurons. You're always going through a cycle of, becoming more efficient in the way you think. It actually moves the other direction. So those who tend to be more skilled and acquire a degree of expertise in a particular domain are going to have less neurons activated when they're engaging in that task or the practices that are associated with that expertise. Certainly, we know that people who are higher in intelligence use less brain power to achieve more things. So they're more efficient in their output. And as a result, when we look at their brains under various forms of imaging like fMRI, we see that they're less active brain structures and less broadly or diffusely active brain structures during complex activities. Where others who aren't as smart or as high in intelligence will be using all of the brain power that they can possibly muster and just barely keeping up with those who are only lifting a finger, so to speak, with their brain power because they've got a lot more in reserve to attack those tasks. So just wanted to clear that up. The brain's not like a muscle. It's very, very different. And we build our intellectual capacity in very different ways. So that's true. And the reason why this is important to recognize is because back in the day, we used to think that memories were stored in a single location in the brain, right? There's memory engram, if you've heard of that. And it was early as the 1920s where we found out that it wasn't like that. Carl Lashley started doing some tests on rats, some pretty, they weren't really animal-friendly tests where he'd chop up parts of their brain and see if it impacted their memory in navigating a maze, reminding them, where cheese is located, see if they could navigate a maze. If you chopped out a section of their brain, would they still remember the next day? And they would. So what it meant was that, and he couldn't find one section of the brain in which the total impairment and collapse of their navigation of the maze existed. So his inference there was that memory is distributed across the brain networks in different ways. And so it's about the activation patterns and the way the nerves communicate, the neurons communicate to one another, that formulates the basis of memory in the brain and learning in the brain, which is including but going beyond memory. And I definitely want to stress that because I see too many people talking about memory as synonymous with learning. They are different things. Memory is necessary but insufficient for learning to occur. There were other works, Seidenberg and McClellan's network theory on learning, and particularly around reading and literacy. They were instrumental in that. Some of the best science of learning research ever done, best neuroscience done in learning, has happened with literacy, children's literacy, and how the brain engages with reading and learning to read. Because we're not born learning to read, so it's a great activity for researchers to study and see how we engage with that from the way the brain shapes itself around that. Now we have this idea called graceful degradation. Thank God for that, because it means that if we get old and we start to forget things, memories can gradually degrade rather than just disappear altogether and burst. And that's the Engram model, the old model of it's a memory stored in one cell versus it's networked over the brain, right? So there's a survival benefit, and that's why it's important to stress that. So it's distributed, memory is distributed all over the brain. There's some key areas there. And I like to present this image because the rock star of what's happening in the classroom, the real rock star of memory, particularly working memory, is the hippocampus. And so you can see the mnemonic I've used to pair the hippopotamus to help you remember the hippo part, and the campus, which is the university wrapped around that. And that's how I remember that. So the hippocampus being the central structure for how we consolidate new memories in long-term from working memory to long-term memory. So that's how the nerves look in the brain. It's a messy business to the right of screen. It's not as sexy and clear as it is on that image to the left. But what happens with retrieval practice and why it's so beneficial is that when you're constantly telling your brain that this is important, you're signaling to it that it's important because you're practicing this notion of bringing something to the fore, to the front of your mind over and over again, your brain is starting to say, okay, well, I better build more pathways and devote more metabolic energy to laying down the pathways to make that memory more robust. So I'll elaborate on it, make sure other networks are connected to it, and I'll build the information highway and continue to maintain that information highway because it's a highly used traffic zone in your brain. And so the retrieval practice sends that signaling to your brain. The neural architecture wraps itself around it. So when you have these moments and when your students have these moments, particularly in performance, high performance and high anxiety and high arousal settings, say, for example, your student has to do a presentation, if their memory goes blank, they might remember that they know these things. So you can have the knowledge there, but not bring it to the fore. And so the retrieval blocking or retrieval failure occurs, even though the memory failure didn't necessarily. And that speaks to two parts, two components, the strength of the storage of the memory and then the strength of the access of the memory. Right? And so then we get these feelings of knowing, I know the lines to this presentation, I've practiced it 1,000 times, but I just can't get it to the fore. So the retrieval blocking and anxiety helps block that sometimes. So we have to practice retrieval over and over again to have a stronger retrieval access pathway, even if the memory itself is strong. It's the accessibility that we need to train. And I won't kind of go through this too much, but you can take a look at this on the recording. It's basically saying that when we have high storage strength coupled with high retrieval strength, that's the accessibility component, we're likely to avoid this idea of retrieval blocking or get to an exam or have our students get to an exam and go mental blank. Even though this stuff, they're not able to bring it to the fore because the anxiety is overcoming the retrieval strength because the retrieval strength is not strong enough. So there's a few ways to consider that. And I won't go through these details, get on to the next one. And you can pause the slides if you want to go back over the recording. And there's, what have we got, about 20 plus ways to engage in retrieval practice. Obviously, the low-hanging fruit there is practice quizzes, practice exams, particularly if that's the outcome that you want your students to measure against. So the question to you is, how can you use retrieval practice in your teaching and use it more often and use it more in a way that's engaging for your students to improve their learning, and teach them about this, teach them the skills. Why are you doing this? Not to cause them great mental anguish and boredom, but to help them learn more rigorously than the alternative approaches like rereading their textbook over and over again. Now, second pillar, and I'll go through this a little bit more quickly, is interleaved practice. And a lot of you will have heard of these. So I want to sort of go from that vague familiarity into a stronger mental model so that you've got a really clear sense of what all this means. It's basically mixing up the order of different topics, tasks, or subjects during the same study period. And we often fail to do this, certainly in schools. I think we're still guilty of giving students a textbook and saying, study that chapter and then do the questions at the end in that block. And that's what we'll do this week. Next week, we'll study the next chapter, do that block, or we'll do it by topics, not just textbooks, but topic blocks, right? We won't interleave and mix those topics up. And as a result, the students fail to make those connections, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. So it's basically mixing up your practice. And you can consider it a form of distributed practice because by virtue of mixing up your practice, if I study a topic now and I'm looking at paintings from Da Vinci, and then I want to look at Rembrandt next, right? If I do Da Vinci all this week and in Rembrandt next week, then I'm blocking my practice and I'm not able to make connections and distinguish the subtle differences or even the obvious differences between those two artists. The benefits that I would get if I studied them in close succession and mixed it up is that I'd be able to start to see those subtleties emerge. They become, my discriminability power would be built up, and therefore I'd improve my conceptual model in detecting those differences and therefore learning. Again, going beyond memory, it's the ability to classify and categorize concepts and differentiate them. And that's what interleaving helps with. Now, I just wanted to quickly clarify why some people believe that interleaved practice is a special case of distributed practice. Well, it's because that if you're, say, studying 3 topics or closely related topics in a single sitting, topic A, B, and C, naturally, once you've gone through that sequence of topic A, B, and C, and you cycle back through it, and go back to topic A for another round of topic A, B, and C, you're going to have had a gap between the topic A study point and the period of study in topic A, where you're studying topic B and C. So there's a natural distribution between the restudy episodes of topic A because you're interspersing other alternative topics in that space there. So rather than just having a blank space in the distributed, this notion of distributed practice, you actually insert other topics in there. If you are a gym goer, it's analogous to doing supersets, where if you're training your biceps, instead of going and sitting down after you've done a full set on your biceps, you can go and start to train triceps. So you're alternating while you're training your triceps, your biceps are having a rest, and vice versa. So you're constantly interspersing different activities there. So kind of like interval training for your mind. That's interleaved practice. Has a relatively high impact on learning. So again, a meta-analysis that came out by Brumar and Richter. And it's different. We've got differential effects for various things. You'll see there one of the anomalies. It's not that great for word learning necessarily compared to blocked practice. And that's partly because word learning, so there's an exception there. So word learning often needs an intense burst and an intensive blocked and not so much randomized aspect to it when you're first engaging with word learning. So it is an exception, but for the most part, the types of learning that we want our students to engage in, the interleaving and mixing up topics and helping them understand how to classify, conceptualize, and differentiate is a really important skill for them to build up, particularly if you've got exams that are randomized as well. There's lots of studies showing some pretty major improvements in learning and at the highest levels. So students engaged in physics and chemistry and university level, getting huge effect sizes, huge improvements in their learning when they go home and they start to do interleaved practice, as opposed to the students who just study in blocks, discrete chunks of topics or discrete blocks of topics. And then when their homework has been done over an 8-week period, I think for this study, the effect sizes on their exam performance were hugely in favor of the students who did the interleaved practice. Now, part of the issue with memory is that memories don't decay over time once they're in long-term memory, right? What is responsible for our memory failure at times is the interference effects between similar concepts. And as I mentioned, interleaving helps us really build the distinctions and demarcations between subtly different or similar concepts, right? So if you're a doctor, interleaving is going to be important for differential diagnosis. You've got to diagnose the problem before you start to prescribe treatments. Right? And so if you're sitting there with a maths test, let me see if I can go to this example. So they're two different skills. Diagnosing and treating are two different skills, and you've got to be good at both. So identifying a problem and solving it are two different skills. And I want to try and, I'll go back to that in a sec. I want to try and point to this idea here. Yeah, let's go to this. Okay, got a painting that's going to come up on screen. And those of you, I know there are plenty of people who are really advanced at their knowledge about art. I am not, but who have we got there on screen? And perhaps you get bonus points if you know which painting this is. So you put that in the chat, or you can speak up if you're super confident there. All right, so we're learning about different styles of painting. It's Pablo Picasso, Girl Before a Mirror. You got that right, well done. And his good buddy, there's your clue. Who's this? His frenemy, Matisse, Sorrows of the King. Okay, this is a bit different. The beginning of the Impressionists, maybe. Georges Rial, the Italian woman. I hope I said that right. So if you're studying these subtly different or even obviously different styles of painting, interleaved practice is a perfect way to engage in that, because you're training your brain to look at different classifications and categories, as well as then retrieving the information about them. Now, the reason why I pointed to the idea of interleaved practice applying to our ability to learn subtle distinctions between different painting styles of various artists is because that's where some of the best research was done, when we had professors like my colleague and friend, Professor Sean Kang, was working with, I think, Hal Pashler and a few others, looking at training students in their ability to look at and detect different painting styles from artists who had similar painting styles, right? So picking out some of the different impressionists, as I put on screen before, and being able to then extrapolate from the training, the interleaved practice, to additional paintings that weren't part of the practice sets, and being able to then transfer that knowledge and being able to detect who the different artists were for that performance set of paintings. So I highly recommend you check out the work of Professor Sean Kang. We also have a podcast on this channel, and I recommend you look at that if you're interested in his work there. So the other thing that you need to be able to do, and our students need to be able to do when they're reading worded mathematical problems, it's a real skill to then, in their brains, classify what type of problem that is, particularly when there are very similar equations and functions that you can apply to different worded problems. And that's not immediately obvious until you put that into an equation. So the students need to be able to first recognize what type of problem the question is asking before they go on the solution pathway and apply the appropriate equation and the appropriate working out strategies there. And it's just an example of exponential, compound, and simple interest problems, which are often confused when you look at the VCE assessments for Victoria and the ATAR assessments for mathematics. You'll often see that students misapply this type of problem solution mismatch there because they haven't been doing enough interleaved practice. They've been studying in discrete blocks. It's also worth noting that some of the largest effect sizes and the most impactful studies and research that has been done on the topic of interleaved practice has been done by Douglas Rowe in interleaved practice applied to mathematics, right? So that's why we know that in the field of mathematics, where there are confusions and highly similar concepts that have huge implications if you try to fit a particular function or equation and mismatch that to the problem, you have all sorts of downstream issues. There are sequential errors that start to propagate through your initial misdiagnosis of the problem. So check out Douglas Rowe's work. It's second to none, and it very much applies to mathematics learning and anything to do with mathematics, all the STEM fields. So check that out. So how can you systematically interleave and mix up the topics? How can you make sure that you're assigning your students different topics and helping them draw connections between and distinctions and differentiate those key concepts, particularly if they're commonly confused? That's the challenge I have for you. Now we'll get to distributed practice. Distributed practice is often referred to as space practice, right? You'll hear a few different names for this, to be honest. It's basically, that's mastering, not mastering. Okay, so there's my spelling error there. Finished the slides this morning. So after initially mastering the material, distributed practice, and again, this is one thing that's not always emphasized enough. So a student achieves initial mastery, meaning they can successfully recall and demonstrate understanding, right? They've achieved the criterion standard. Teacher knows, the student knows, and we know that they know. Once that's been achieved, distribution of practice in how you engage in revising and consolidating that material and elaborating and extending the learning, distribution of practice is really important. Thereafter, it means that you spread out study activities over time instead of just doing the one and done principle or cramming it into a single block of study, which is known as massed practice. So distribution of practice, just like you're watering a plant, a little bit, it's often, no one wants to water a plant 3 months worth in one go. So there's a few alternative terms for it: space practice, spacing effect, or just spacing. It's contrasted with massed practice, where you do it all at once, which is often commonly referred to as cramming. The problem with cramming as well is that, people do it because they actually believe it works better than space practice. So there's a lot of low level of knowledge about the science of learning in the learning community, and the students don't always know what the best tools on their tool belt are, and they think the more effective ones are actually those that are least effective. Cramming is where they have a misunderstanding of its effectiveness. But it's obvious that it is far inferior to distributed practice. So there's plenty of evidence about that, and the effect sizes are not small. It's one of the largest effects on study. It's probably one of the most, in my view, one of the most robust learning strategies in terms of replicability and research credibility, and also in terms of the massive effect size difference you get from studying where you spread out your revisions as opposed to doing it all in the day or the couple of days before the exam or the essays due. So if we want our students to get that education, not just a degree, distributing practice and making sure we have a schedule where they're allowed to, and there's space in our curriculum and in our learning design here to revisit material and bring it back to the front of their mind and elaborate and extend their knowledge. One other little tidbit here that's really helpful is that, and this is why I've said slow is fast and fast is slow, because the initial encoding is really important here. When I talked about this idea of the how people forget to mention that distributed practice happens after you've achieved the criterion outcome, which is mastery. You've demonstrated some level of mastery where you can correctly recall or demonstrate to a teacher that your knowledge and skills are at the sufficient standard that they want. Once you've achieved that criterion outcome, usually we move on and don't look back. However, their distributed practice principle is to continue to revise and revisit those key concepts, right? But the initial encoding is the important piece in this research here, because what it's saying is, if you did the initial encoding to satisfy the criterion variable, such as getting 88 out of 10 questions on a quiz correct, or it might be 100% correct, or demonstrating in verbal communication to somebody that you understand a key concept, if you do that one time, as opposed to 3 times, when you demonstrate it 3 times in the initial criterion variable, the criterion outcome, you demonstrate that to your teacher 3 times over, that initial encoding pays dividends down the track by chopping the distributed practice time to reach the same success criteria, chopping it down by 10 to 30%, right? So what I'm saying is, if I do the initial encoding and really build a rich body of success in how I'm recalling a concept, say if I do the quiz 3 times over and get 10 out of 10 3 times, and my buddy is doing it only once, hey, I got them all right, I'm not going to do it again, I'll revisit it next week. Whereas I'm doing it 3 times before I revisit it next week. Well, next week, he's going to be spending 60 minutes getting to that same criterion outcome of 100% right. I'm going to be spending, 40 minutes. Then the next time, even less, even less, even less. So there's long-term dividends to the initial encoding, making sure the initial understanding's really rich, and we repeat until we are got the automatic knowledge. That's the really important part here. Now, this was one of the parts of the recording that made me cringe in listening to myself, because I rambled like crazy. The basic story here is the research shows that the deeper your initial encoding and the more automaticity and how automatic your knowledge is in terms of how fluent you can retrieve that information with accuracy,
the better it is downstream in terms of the efficiency of your restudy episodes. So initial encoding is really deep. That means you save yourself time to achieve optimal restudy episodes later on. So your distributed practice becomes more efficient off the back of a really solid, deep initial encoding of that knowledge and skills or concept or whatever it is you're trying to learn in the first place. So do it well in the first place and it pays dividends in the future.
So there's other benefits to distributed practice, and I'll point this out here because this all speaks to research that's 130 years old. And so Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1885 developed this thing called the forgetting curve. This is once he tested himself on a whole lot of what he called nonsense syllables, and I've got examples there, Tal, said, Vog, Doff. He tested himself on whole word lists, so 60 odd, I think, in the initial tests, and he'd get to success criteria, that is where he can recall them 100% correct. He'd then wait for 20 minutes up to 31 days before retesting himself, seeing how much he could remember. Then he would map it out. So painstaking stuff. He did it all on himself and wrote a book called On Memory and famously developed this forgetting curve. And you can see 41.8% forgotten after 20 minutes, 55.8% after 2 days, 74.6% after 6 days, and a whole lot, 78.9% after 31 days, right? So this is said to be the kind of baseline conditions of how we forget information over time. So really important. But what I want to point out are a few exceptions here, which is these are the little known aspects to this forgetting curve. And it points to the benefits of distributed practice and why that works. So can you tell me what the exceptions are? The first is what's happening in the middle of the curve. Right, so you look at the curve to your right of screen. Why has it got this middle section, this middle plateau? So maybe you can write in the chat what's going on there. And I can't read the chat, I don't think. So maybe you could let me know what's written in the chat. What's happening?
We've got one answer. They've slept. It's moved into long-term memory.
Yeah. So sleeping has a causal benefit to learning. So that's what's happening. These smooth curves that you see in the textbooks, that's not telling the story of sleep. Sleep allows time for rehearsal. Our brains are never inactive. They're often busiest during sleep. What are they doing is the age-old question. Scientists are still working that out, but part of it is to consolidate our learning and rehearse and build and enrich and simulate our mental models of the world. And we do that through sleep. We know it can be hugely detrimental.
Now, I think by this part of the presentation, I was really starting to rush and looking at the clock. Trying to race against the clock means I'm going to make lots of mistakes, particularly because I haven't practiced this presentation much. And I think I mentioned that having lots of sleep will be really detrimental. Obviously, that is incorrect. So I want to encourage you to have good, solid sleep. It's really beneficial for your learning. It's not only a correlate of effective learning and good grades in schools, but it's causal. It has a causal mechanism to improve our learning. So I encourage you to get good, healthy sleep on the back of good study, work-life balance. So sleep is good.
I won't go through this because we won't have enough time, but if you're to do an Ebbinghaus test, I'd try and get you to remember 10 of these nonsense syllables. And what we'd also find that's not always evident in the forgetting curves is this. And we'd remember we'd have a higher probability of recalling the first couple and the last couple of nonsense syllables compared to the breadth in between. And that's because of this, the serial position effect. We have forgetting as a property of the position of any list of items that we have to remember, right? So there's a recency bias and the primacy bias. The first things that we encounter, the last things we encounter tend to be what we are more effective at remembering. The other thing that he didn't account for necessarily is that his active attempts at recall actually interrupted the forgetting itself. So he's engaging in distributed practice, and he did it serendipitously. And not only did was he responsible for mapping out the first forgetting curve, but inadvertently he realized he's developing the first learning curve. Because if you look at what's happening when you interrupt the forgetting curve by studying a second time, third time, a fourth time, before your final criterion outcome, you're actually offsetting the forgetting until you get to that stage of absolute mastery where you very rarely revise to be able to successfully recall. So you're building a learning curve. And this is what we want our students to achieve. This is what we want for ourselves, where we get to that point of absolute mastery, where there's diminishing returns on restudy, and we can spread out the distribution of revision way out into the months or years territory, so we can remember things for a lifetime and dust off the cobwebs and bring it to the front of our mind quite easily because our learning's so robust. There's some reasons why cramming hurts learning. There's so many reasons why, but causes stress, lack of sleep, fatigue can impair learning itself, the concentration. There's a lot of indirect effects as well. So for our students, if they don't know that by now, big problems. There's your before and after, or your contrast between students who cram and students who don't. I'll touch on this one just to point out, and I won't go through this thought experiment, just to point out that the idea of distributing practice over time allows many, many other benefits to accrue. And when you distribute your practice over time, you can practice in a variety of locations, right? So when you do that, you're stamping in to that memory. When you're bringing it to the front of your mind and you're reconstructing the past in the present in a retrieval practice episode, you're also starting to bring in some of the things about how you're feeling and the context around you. And there's a famous study there by Badley and Godden. And it was a classic because it showed that when people studied underwater, they were more successful in the recall underwater than they were on land, and vice versa. People who studied on land, a word list on land, were more successful when they were tested on land as opposed to underwater. It's quite an unusual finding because you'd think that everyone would be more successful on land, but it showed the power of context-specific encoding. So we encode part of the context when we recall and when we do the initial encoding, the learning, and that carries through to subsequent revisions as well. It's not just the initial encoding, it's every single distributed practice event that we have. We bring a piece of the environment, the piece of how our state and the context of learning into that. And that what that does is it elaborates our mental model and means that we've got a whole lot more cues to anchor our retrieval on when we go to get that memory in the future. So there's many different doors to access that room in which our memory is stored if you distribute over time, as opposed to cramming it all into the one occasion. So there's some real power in that. Let's go on to the last topic because we're about to run out of time. Expert practice. What is it? It's a sustained attempt at goal-oriented, systematic and focused practice that seeks to push the learner outside of their comfort zone with a distinct emphasis on improving weakness through feedback. It's a mouthful, but if you step back and you say, oh, I know all about retrieval practice, interleaved practice, and I know to distribute that over time, then you need to ask yourself, well, hang on, if I'm approaching my study like an athlete here and I want to do it to my maximum capability, I've got to do even more than that. I've got to step back and start to design the bigger picture here. And that's what the whole expert practice, or what we call deliberate practice, is all about. It's about designing a schedule or a program of study and approaching it like an athlete. And there's key elements to that. So it's also got a few other names here: deliberate practice, purposeful practice, targeted practice, and structured practice. They're all the same thing. Anders Ericsson was the pioneer here. He talks about 5 or 4 key ingredients: focused goals, sustained effort over an extended period of time. And I'll finish up, I think, on one of the myths of how much time that is. It's not 10,000 hours. So that's a bit of a hint there. But also getting feedback from other experts. In other words, you, teachers. So what's the evidence say? Well, goal setting certainly helps. The SMART goals and the SMARTer goals, they're great acronyms, but they're not that necessary. There's a lot of redundancy built into those acronyms. It's really those two pieces there: being specific and difficult, but controllable. So challenging and attainable goals, writing them down and specifying those. They're the key characteristics of successful goal setting and attainment. There's debate about how important the idea of expert practice is, or deliberate practice is, for different fields, and how much it contributes to the outcome variation between athletes, musicians, teachers, students, all of those sorts of things. The most updated review by the most cynical people in the field talked about it as having 14% or 100% of the variation in the distribution of outcomes explicable by expert practice, right? So it does, at its very least, contribute to a substantial amount of variation in the expertise of different performances and different domains of expertise that this whole research field is engaged with. And I think I'll finish on this because we're about to run out of time. But if you hear people talking about this idea of the 10,000 hour rule, please do correct the record and tempt yourself into this discussion, because Malcolm Gladwell popularized this idea based on a misunderstanding of Erikson's work. And he talked about the 10,000 hour rule. And he says this, I'll read the quote to the right. In fact, researchers have settled on what they believe is the magic number for true expertise. 10,000 hours is the magic number of greatness. Yes, he certainly didn't understate that. So if you've got outliers, maybe time for donating that to the op shop. Anders Ericsson came back a few years later because this just got out of hand and the popular press just continued to roll with this. And as they say, the truth gets halfway around the world before, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. I think that was by Winston Churchill, right? And so Ericsson's coming in late to the scene, but correcting the record, saying, hearing from, there's no such thing as a 10,000 hour rule, isn't even a rule. It's wrong in several ways. There's a quote from his book about why it's wrong. He talks about it as being seductively irresistible in terms of the mimetic qualities of it. That is how readily it is passed on around popular press without question. So just be careful there of adopting this idea that it takes 10,000 hours to acquire expertise in any field. Simply not true. Too many other variables. I won't go through any of this. I think we'll call it a day there, other than to say expertise, one of the interesting things about how expertise is represented in the brain and various brain imaging studies is that you have this complex relationship where, I'll read it out. There's a great quote here from, where is it? This study, okay, at a high level, expertise is evident in a small number of specific brain regions, whereas at a low level of expertise is reflected broadly. So it means that we're inefficient. So low levels of expertise are actually drawing upon wider brain regions. So expertise, the hallmark of expertise in the brain is being really efficient, metabolically efficient in how they generate the most relevant information and bring that to the fore. Again, experts have gone through the R.I.D.E model over and over again. They've retrieved it, they've interleaved it, they've distributed their practice, and they've become an expert in that way. And so their brains are more efficient at getting to the same outcomes compared to a novice who has to work a lot harder for that. And so you see that in the brain studies where there's a lot more noise amongst the signal when you're trying to get to a key concept.
Now, by this stage, I'm looking at the clock going, I'm out of time. So I'm trying to rush through this and making all sorts of errors. This is a good lesson for me to know why I should engage in more practice before my presentations. And I hope you can look at this as it unfolds and let this be a lesson to you as to why we need to have a lot of practice to perform better. And if you want to perform at an expert level, you've also got to engage in practice at an expert level. Some people often think of the notion of expertise as just a performance-driven construct, where expertise happens in the Olympics, it happens on the stage of a theatre company where you're looking at a performance of an opera singer or somebody, a playwright, something like that, an actor. But it's not like that. Right. The hardest and most important work that's being done for any form of expertise is in the practice. And it's where the experts and the novices are separated, is where you apply the expertise, not just to the performance, but to the practice itself. Right. Expert practice leads to expert performance. And that's the take-home message here.
Flicking over here and finish on that. None of this is rocket science. It's going to help you learn rocket science, and it's the best way to do so.
Now that brings us to the conclusion of this presentation. Obviously, it wasn't one of my finest presentations, and that's because I didn't, drumroll, practice beforehand, and that's going to be a lesson in irony for me to consider for future presentations. I've got to practice what I preach, and I hope that you can take something enjoyable and interesting and helpful out of this presentation. If you do like this channel and you have enjoyed this content, please think of subscribing or giving it a thumbs up, because it's going to encourage me and give me a bit more incentive to create more content into the future. So thanks so much for listening. I appreciate your time.